In Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, a seemingly invisible janitor was about to face the ultimate test of his hidden identity. What started as routine floor mopping took a shocking turn when they came face to face with catastrophic system failure at 40,000 feet. Henry Alvarez wasn't your typical custodial worker. For 15 years, he had spent his life buried in anonymity, hiding from his past as a decorated Air Force flight engineer, known for his legendary ability to land damaged aircraft under impossible conditions. When he encountered Flight 447's cascading emergencies and an unconscious captain, he had no idea he was walking into his moment of redemption. Henry's decision to step into that cockpit would lead to the most harrowing emergency landing in commercial aviation history. What began as invisible servitude would become heroic revelation. The passengers who had dismissed him as just the mop man would never be the same after discovering that the janitor they'd ignored for years was the only person capable of bringing them home alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport hummed their eternal song at 5:47 a.m., casting harsh shadows across Terminal C as Henry Alvarez pushed his janitor's cart through the awakening concourse. His left leg dragged slightly, a limp so subtle that most people attributed it to age rather than the piece of shrapnel that had been his unwelcome companion for 15 years. At 52, Henry moved through the airport like a ghost who had forgotten he was dead, invisible to the river of passengers, airline staff, and security personnel who flowed around him with the casual indifference reserved for furniture. The cart's squeaky wheel announced his presence with each revolution, though no one bothered to look. Henry preferred it that way. In the breast pocket of his gray uniform shirt, he carried 3 items that never left his side: a faded photograph, creased soft at the edges, a silver wedding band that no longer fit any finger that mattered, and a twisted piece of metal no bigger than a quarter, debris from an F-15 Eagle that exploded over Afghan airspace one night when everything went wrong. "Hey, mop man!" The voice cut through the ambient airport noise like a blade. Marcus Kent, first officer for Skyline Airlines, stood near Gate 24 with his captain's jacket slung over his shoulder and his trademark smirk firmly in place. At 28, Marcus wore his privilege like expensive cologne, impossible to ignore and slightly nauseating up close. "Think you could actually clean something today instead of just pushing dirt around?" The other crew members laughed, their morning coffee still warm in their hands. Henry said nothing, just adjusted his grip on the mop handle and continued working around their feet. His eyes, sharp brown eyes that had once tracked enemy aircraft at 30,000 feet, remained focused on the floor, but they missed nothing. Marcus's shoes were Italian leather, probably cost more than Henry made in a month. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, the kind Henry had seen on the wrists of pilots who'd never seen real combat. Everything about Marcus Kent screamed money and connections, the kind of man who'd never had to prove himself when it mattered. "I'm talking to you, janitor," Marcus pressed, stepping directly into Henry's path. "You deaf as well as useless?" "Sorry, sir," Henry murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just trying to finish up here." Marcus's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Trying. That's about all you're good for, isn't it?" He turned to the other crew members. 15 years this guy's been mopping floors. 15 years. You'd think he'd have figured out how to do it right by now. Henry's hands tightened imperceptibly on the mop handle. 15 years of invisible servitude, of biting his tongue while men like Marcus threw around casual cruelty like confetti. 15 years of carrying secrets that would make Marcus's borrowed authority look like a child's toy. But Henry just nodded and moved his cart aside without another word. "Henry." The voice was soft, kind, a stark contrast to Marcus's mockery. Anya Patel approached with a genuine smile, her flight attendant uniform immaculate despite the early hour. At 34, she had the kind of weary kindness that came from years of dealing with difficult passengers and difficult colleagues. "Morning, Miss Patel. How are you feeling today?" It was a simple question, but it was more genuine human interaction than Henry received from most people in a week. "Morning, Miss Patel. I'm well, thank you." Anya studied his face with the careful attention of someone who actually saw people rather than just their uniforms and job titles. "Your leg bothering you? I noticed you favoring it yesterday." For a moment, Henry's careful mask slipped. No one noticed his limp. No one cared enough to notice it. "It's nothing. Old injury acting up with the weather change." "Old injury?" Anya's eyebrows rose slightly. There was something in Henry's tone, a depth that suggested stories hidden beneath the surface. "Military?" Henry's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Long time ago, miss. Different life." Before Anya could probe further, a commotion near the gate drew their attention. A small girl, maybe 6 years old, had broken away from her mother and was barreling toward Henry's cart with the fearless determination of childhood. Her brown hair flew behind her like a banner, and her face was bright with excitement. "Mister! Mister!" she called, skidding to a halt in front of Henry's cart. "I made you something." Henry blinked, startled. In 15 years of janitorial work, no passenger had ever approached him voluntarily, let alone a child bearing gifts. The little girl thrust a piece of construction paper toward him, her face glowing with pride. "It's an airplane," she announced unnecessarily. The crayon drawing was unmistakably a commercial airliner, complete with windows, wings, and what appeared to be clouds surrounding it. "I drew it for you because you look like you love airplanes." Henry stared at the drawing, his throat suddenly tight. The child's innocent observation hit closer to the truth than she could possibly know. That's very kind of you, miss. It's beautiful." Sarah, get back here right now." The girl's mother hurried over, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she said to Henry without really looking at him. "She's going through a phase where she talks to everyone." "It's no trouble," Henry said quietly, carefully folding the drawing and slipping it into his shirt pocket next to his other treasures. "She's very talented." Sarah beamed up at him. "Are you going to fly on our airplane? I hope you do. You have nice eyes, like a pilot." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He crouched down slowly, bringing himself to eye level with the child. "What makes you say that, little one?" "They're watching eyes. Like they see everything. Pilots have to see everything, right?" Henry's breath caught. This child, this innocent stranger, had seen something in him that trained professionals missed every day. "Yes," he said softly, "they do." Sarah's mother tugged her away with apologetic murmurs, but the little girl waved at Henry over her shoulder until they disappeared into the boarding queue. Henry stood slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to his shirt pocket where the drawing now rested alongside his other memories. Anya had watched the entire exchange with growing curiosity. There had been something in Henry's face when the child mentioned pilots, a flash of recognition and pain that spoke of depths she'd only glimpsed. "She's not wrong, you know. You do have pilot's eyes." Henry's mask slammed back into place. "Just an old man who spent too many years watching planes come and go, Miss Patel. Nothing more." But as he pushed his cart toward the next gate, Anya noticed how his gaze automatically tracked the aircraft visible through the terminal windows, how his head tilted slightly when jets fired up their engines as if he were listening for something specific, and how his hands, weathered and scarred, moved with an unconscious precision that spoke of muscle memory and training that went far beyond pushing a mop. At Gate 24, the morning shift was preparing for the 8:15 flight to Denver. Captain Laura Jensen, 39, and rising through the ranks with steady determination, stood reviewing her pre-flight checklist with the calm authority of someone who'd logged over 8,000 flight hours. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the regulation style, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. Everything about Laura Jensen screamed competence and control. Henry began cleaning around the gate area, his movements economical and unobtrusive. To the crew and early arriving passengers, he might as well have been part of the furniture. But Henry's trained eyes cataloged details that others missed. The slight tremor in Marcus's hands as he reviewed his paperwork,
the way Laura's jaw tightened when she noticed Marcus's lack of preparation, and the growing line of passengers who showed the telltale signs of a long travel day ahead. As Henry worked, fragments of conversation drifted past him like smoke. Weather reports, fuel calculations, passenger manifests, the familiar rhythms of aviation, the careful choreography of getting tons of metal and hundreds of lives safely from point A to point B. It was a symphony he had once conducted himself, back when his opinion mattered and his expertise was valued rather than invisible. The child's drawing crinkled softly in his pocket as he moved, a tangible reminder that somewhere in this vast airport, someone had seen past his uniform to the man beneath. Someone had looked into his eyes and seen a pilot. The morning sun slanted through the terminal windows as passengers began gathering around Gate 24, their voices creating the familiar buzz of anticipation and mild irritation that accompanied commercial air travel. Henry finished mopping near the gate counter just as the boarding announcement echoed through the concourse. Crisp and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to begin pre-boarding for Skyline Flight 447 with service to Denver. At this time, we'll welcome our first-class passengers and those requiring special assistance.
Captain Laura Jensen stood near the jetway entrance, her presence commanding even without the uniform's authority. She greeted passengers with practiced warmth, her smile genuine but efficient. To the traveling public, she represented everything they wanted in a pilot: confident, competent, reassuring. She'd worked hard to cultivate that image, fighting for respect in an industry that still questioned women's place in the cockpit. "Good morning, folks," Laura said to a family passing by. "Beautiful day for flying. We should have smooth skies all the way to Denver." Henry watched her from his position near the windows, recognizing the careful balance she maintained. He'd seen that same composure in military pilots, the ability to project calm authority while managing dozens of variables that passengers never considered. But there was something else in her bearing, a subtle tension that suggested she shared the common assumption that ground crew and service personnel existed in a different realm entirely. As if summoned by his thoughts, Marcus Kent appeared beside Laura, his captain's jacket now properly in place, his hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. He was the kind of man who looked good in a uniform and knew it, the kind who'd grown up expecting deference and rarely found himself disappointed. "Coffee spill in the galley," Marcus announced to no one in particular. "Someone needs to clean it up before we board." Laura glanced around until her eyes landed on Henry. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the automatic authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Could you handle a small cleanup on board? Nothing major, just some spilled coffee." Henry nodded and gathered his supplies. This wasn't unusual. Maintenance spills, passenger accidents, last-minute cleaning needs. What was unusual was being on board an aircraft again, even as a janitor. As he wheeled his cart toward the jetway, he tried to ignore the way his pulse quickened at the prospect of being inside a cockpit environment again, however briefly. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, one of the workhorses of commercial aviation. Henry's trained eye automatically assessed its condition as he boarded, new enough to have modern avionics, old enough to show the wear of thousands of flights. The galley spill was minor, just a puddle of coffee that had sloshed from an unsecured pot during pre-flight preparations. But as Henry knelt to clean the mess, his peripheral vision caught something that made his blood run cold. A hydraulic line near the galley showed signs of stress, minute metal shavings that suggested internal wear, the kind of thing that could cause catastrophic failure under the right circumstances. It was subtle, the kind of detail that might escape casual inspection, but would be obvious to someone with his background. "Problem, mop man?" Marcus appeared in the galley doorway, his tone carrying its usual edge of condescension. "It's just coffee. Even you should be able to handle that." Henry's instinct was to mention the hydraulic issue, but 15 years of invisibility had taught him that his observations weren't welcome. "No problem, sir. Just finishing up." "Good. We're behind schedule already." Marcus glanced at his watch with theatrical impatience. "Could you move a little faster? Some of us have real work to do."
The casual cruelty of the comment hit Henry like a familiar slap. Real work. As if keeping an airport clean and functional wasn't real work. As if Henry hadn't once been responsible for systems far more complex than anything Marcus had ever touched. As if the man mopping up coffee spills hadn't once landed an F-15 on a carrier deck in rough seas with half of his instrumentation dead. "Yes, sir," Henry said quietly, his voice betraying nothing of the storm beneath the surface. "I'll be out of your way in just a moment." Marcus's laugh was sharp. "You know what your problem is, janitor? No ambition. 15 years pushing the same mop, cleaning up other people's messes. Don't you ever want more than this?" Henry's hand stilled on the mop handle. More than this? If Marcus only knew what this had cost him. What more had once meant before it all came crashing down in a ball of fire and twisted metal and screaming voices on the radio. "I'm content with my work, sir." Content. That's the difference between men like me and men like you. I reach for the sky, you clean up what falls back down. The irony was so bitter Henry could taste it. Marcus Kent reaching for a sky that Henry had once owned, talking down to a man who'd flown missions that would have left Marcus weeping in his expensive Italian shoes. But Henry just nodded and continued cleaning, letting the insult roll off him like water off glass. "Marcus, we need to start boarding." Laura's voice carried a note of impatience as she appeared behind him. "The gate agent is getting antsy." "Right. Try to finish up quickly, Henry. Real pilots are trying to work here." As the crew moved toward the cockpit, Henry allowed himself one moment of pure fury. Real pilots. The phrase echoed in his mind as he finished cleaning, as he gathered his supplies, as he prepared to slip back into invisibility. Real pilots like Marcus Kent, who'd probably never faced anything more challenging than turbulence over the Rockies. Real pilots who'd never had to make split-second decisions while their best friend's voice screamed over the radio and enemy fire lit up the sky around them. But the moment passed, as they always did. Henry finished his work and prepared to leave the aircraft, his secret burning in his chest like swallowed acid. The hydraulic issue would likely be caught during the next major inspection. Probably. Maybe. The stress patterns weren't immediately dangerous, just concerning to an eye trained to spot potential failures before they became catastrophic.
As he wheeled his cart back through the jetway, Henry caught sight of the passengers beginning to board. The little girl who'd given him the drawing was among them, holding her mother's hand and practically bouncing with excitement. Their eyes met for a moment, and she waved at him with the same bright smile she'd worn earlier. "Are you flying with us?" she called out, her voice carrying over the noise of boarding passengers. Henry shook his head, unable to trust his voice. The child's face fell slightly, disappointed, and something twisted in Henry's chest. He thought about what it would mean to be on that plane, to be responsible for those lives again, the weight of it, the trust, the terrible possibility of failure. "Maybe next time," he managed to say, and the little girl's smile returned. "I hope so. I still think you'd be a good pilot." As Henry pushed his cart back into the terminal, the child's words echoed in his mind. A good pilot. Once, that had been true. Once, he'd been more than good. He'd been exceptional. But that was before the mission that went wrong, before the choices that still haunted his dreams, before he'd learned that sometimes even the best pilots couldn't save everyone. Flight 447 pushed back from the gate at 8:23 a.m., 8 minutes behind schedule, but well within acceptable parameters. In the cockpit, Captain Laura Jensen ran through the final checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed the same routine thousands of times. The Boeing 737-800 responded to her commands with the reliability that had made it the backbone of commercial aviation. "Tower, Skyline 447 requesting taxi clearance." Laura spoke into her headset, her voice carrying the calm authority that passengers found so reassuring. "Skyline 447, taxi to runway 18R via taxiway Alpha, hold short of the runway. Taxiway Alpha to 18R, hold short, Skyline 447. Beside her, Marcus Kent reviewed his own checklist, though his attention seemed divided between the instruments and his reflection in the cockpit window. He'd performed well enough during training, but Laura had noticed a tendency toward overconfidence that concerned her.
Still, he had the credentials and the connections, and the airline valued both. "Looking good out there," Marcus commented, gesturing toward the clear morning sky visible through the cockpit windows. "Should be smooth sailing all the way to Denver." Laura nodded, though something nagged at the back of her mind. A vibration she had felt during taxi, so subtle it might have been imagination, a momentary flutter in the hydraulic pressure gauge that had returned to normal before she could be certain she'd seen it. In 39 years of life and 15 years of flying, she'd learned to trust her instincts, but she'd also learned that paranoia could be as dangerous as complacency. "Skyline 447, you're cleared for takeoff, runway 18R. "Cleared for takeoff, 18R, Skyline 447. The engine spooled up to full power, pressing passengers back into their seats with the familiar acceleration of modern jet propulsion. Laura felt the aircraft come alive beneath her hands, tons of metal and humanity defying gravity through the marriage of physics and engineering. It was a feeling that never got old, the moment when Earth released its claim and sky took over. 27 rows behind the cockpit, Henry Alvarez should have been back in the terminal, emptying trash cans and mopping floors. Instead, he sat in the rear galley, having been asked to remain on board to handle a minor maintenance issue that required his attention once they reached cruising altitude. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Sometimes it was more efficient to have maintenance personnel travel with the aircraft rather than wait for ground crew at the destination. As the plane climbed through 10,000 feet, Henry tried to focus on the paperwork in his lap, but his attention kept drifting to the subtle vibrations he felt through the aircraft structure. To most people, commercial aircraft were mysterious machines that somehow stayed aloft through forces they didn't understand. To Henry, every sound and sensation told a story about the complex systems working in harmony to keep them airborne. What he felt now wasn't harmonious. The vibration was barely perceptible, a frequency pattern that spoke of stress in the hydraulic system. It was the same issue he'd noticed in the galley during boarding, now manifesting under the pressures of flight. His trained instinct screamed at him to say something, to alert the crew, but who would listen to a janitor's concerns about aircraft systems? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Jensen. We've reached our cruising altitude of 40,000 feet, and I've turned off the fasten seatbelt sign. Feel free to move about the cabin, but please keep your seatbelts fastened when seated, as we may encounter some light turbulence. Our flight time to Denver today should be about 2 hours and 15 minutes.
Henry closed his eyes and let himself drift back 15 years, to a time when he'd worn captain's bars and commanded the respect that came with expertise. Captain Henry Alvarez, flight engineer on some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. He'd understood every system, every backup, every redundancy built into machines designed to operate in environments that would kill their crews in seconds if something went wrong. The memory was bitter and sweet in equal measure. He'd been good at his job, more than good. He'd been exceptional. His commanding officers had spoken of fast-track promotions, of assignments that would have put him in line for the most prestigious positions in military aviation. But that was before Afghanistan, before the mission that had changed everything. The flight had been routine, a transport run that should have been milk and cookies. Henry's F-15, fully loaded with supplies for a forward operating base, accompanied by his wingman and best friend, Captain Jim Morrison. They'd flown together for 3 years, trusted each other with their lives on a dozen missions. Jim was supposed to get married when they returned stateside, to a teacher from Ohio who sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and letters that made Jim smile for days. The surface-to-air missile had come out of nowhere, an obsolete Soviet system that shouldn't have been able to track their aircraft, but somehow did. Jim's F-15 took the hit directly, the explosion visible for miles. Henry had circled the crash site, calling desperately for any sign of life, but there had been nothing but smoke and burning fuel. The investigation that followed was thorough and devastating. Intelligence failures, inadequate reconnaissance, faulty equipment, a cascade of small mistakes that had added up to a dead pilot and a best friend Henry would never see again. Technically, Henry hadn't been at fault. The missile strike was classified as enemy action, not pilot error. But Henry knew the truth that the investigators missed. He should have seen it coming. His job was to watch the instruments, to monitor the threats, to keep them both safe. He'd failed, and Jim had paid the price. The guilt had eaten at him like acid, destroying his confidence and his career in equal measure. He'd started second-guessing himself, hesitating in situations that required split-second decisions. His commanding officer, General Robert Hayes, had been blunt in his assessment. "A pilot who doesn't trust himself is a danger to everyone around him, Alvarez. Maybe it's time to consider other options." Other options, like pushing a mop in an airport, invisible and ignored, carrying the weight of his failure like stones in his pockets. "Sir? Sir, are you all right?" Henry opened his eyes to find Anya Patel looking down at him with concern. He'd been so lost in memory that he hadn't heard her approach, and his face must have shown more than he intended. "I'm fine, Miss Patel. Just tired." Anya studied his expression with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading passengers' emotional states. "You looked like you were somewhere else entirely. Somewhere difficult." Henry forced a smile. "Just wool gathering. Old men do that sometimes." "My grandfather was a pilot," Anya said quietly, settling into the jump seat across from him. "Commercial, not military, but he had the same look sometimes, like he was flying missions in his mind." The observation was too close to the truth for comfort. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was. He used to tell me that the sky never forgets a pilot, even when the pilot tries to forget the sky." Anya paused, watching Henry's face carefully. "He said that good pilots carry their aircraft with them wherever they go, in their hands, in their eyes, in the way they listen to sounds that other people don't even notice." Henry's breath caught. This woman, this flight attendant who barely knew him, had just described the burden he'd carried for 15 years with more accuracy than any therapist or counselor ever had. "Your grandfather was a perceptive man." "He'd like you," Anya said with a smile. "He always said you could tell a real pilot by the way they watch the sky, even when they're on the ground." Before Henry could respond, a subtle change in the aircraft's behavior caught his attention. The vibration he'd been monitoring had intensified slightly, and there was a new sound, a barely audible whine that spoke of stress in the hydraulic system. It was still within normal parameters, but heading in the wrong direction. Anya noticed his sudden alertness. "What is it?" Henry hesitated. 15 years of being invisible, of having his observations dismissed or ignored, warred with instincts that screamed danger. "Probably nothing. Just... Do you hear that sound?" Anya tilted her head, listening. "What sound?" "High-pitched whine, very faint, coming from somewhere forward." Henry's voice carried a note of urgency that he couldn't quite suppress. "It might be worth mentioning to the captain." "You think something's wrong?" Anya's training kicked in, her casual demeanor shifting to professional alertness. I think someone should take a look at the hydraulic pressure readings." Henry met her eyes, letting her see something of the man behind the janitor's uniform. "Just to be safe." Anya studied his face for a long moment, weighing his words against his position, his expertise against his job title. What she saw there, the intensity, the knowledge, the barely concealed authority, convinced her that this was more than a janitor's idle concern. "I'll speak to the captain," she said, rising from her seat. As Anya made her way toward the cockpit, Henry felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd spoken up, broken his 15-year silence about matters of aviation safety. The question now was whether anyone would listen to a janitor's concerns about systems he supposedly knew nothing about. In his pocket, the little girl's airplane drawing crinkled as he shifted in his seat, a reminder of innocence and trust and the terrible responsibility that came with both. Somewhere in the passenger cabin, that child was probably coloring or reading, trusting in the competence of people she'd never met to deliver her safely to her destination. Henry closed his eyes again, but this time his memories weren't of failure and guilt. Instead, he thought of Elena, his wife who'd died of cancer 3 years after his discharge from the Air Force. She'd been the only person who truly understood his burden, the only one who'd seen past his guilt to the man he could still be. "The sky will call you back someday," she'd whispered during one of her last lucid moments. "When it does, you have to answer. Not for yourself, but for everyone who needs you to be who you really are." At 40,000 feet, surrounded by the familiar sounds and sensations of powered flight, Henry wondered if that day had finally arrived. The first alarm pierced the cabin air at 9:47 a.m., a sharp electronic shriek that cut through the drone of conversation and crying children like a blade through silk. In the cockpit, Captain Laura Jensen's hands moved instinctively to the instrument panel as warning lights bloomed across the displays like deadly flowers. "What the hell?" Marcus began, but his words were swallowed by a second alarm, then a third, until the cockpit filled with a cacophony of electronic warnings that spoke of cascading system failures. The aircraft shuddered, a violent tremor that ran through the fuselage like a living thing. In the passenger cabin, coffee cups went flying, and overhead bins rattled ominously. Children began to cry, and the conversations that had filled the air moments ago died away, replaced by the tense silence of people who sensed danger but didn't understand it. "Hydraulic failure, primary and secondary systems," Laura called out, her voice tight with concentration as she fought to maintain control. The yoke felt sluggish in her hands, the aircraft's responses delayed and unpredictable. "Marcus, I need you to run the emergency checklist, now." But Marcus Kent, for all his swagger and confidence, had frozen. His face had gone pale and his hands trembled as he stared at the sea of red warning lights that painted the cockpit in hellish hues. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not on his watch. His training manual had covered system failures, but the reality of alarms screaming and an aircraft fighting against his commands was overwhelming his carefully constructed facade. "Marcus!" Laura's voice cracked like a whip. "The checklist." I can't... Which one?" Marcus fumbled through the emergency procedures manual, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the pages. "There are so many. Hydraulic, electrical, pressurization." "All of them," Laura said grimly, as a new warning light indicated cabin pressure loss. The oxygen masks dropped from their compartments throughout the aircraft, dangling like yellow anacondas, while passengers stared at them in growing horror. In the rear galley, Henry felt the pressure change in his ears and knew immediately what it meant. Rapid decompression at 40,000 feet was a death sentence unless handled quickly and correctly. His military training kicked in automatically, 15 years of suppressed instincts flooding back in a rush of clarity and purpose. "Everyone remain calm," Henry's voice rang out through the cabin, carrying an authority that cut through the rising panic. "Put on your oxygen masks immediately. Place the mask over your nose and mouth and breathe normally. Help others after you've secured your own mask." Passengers who had been fumbling with their masks stopped and looked at this janitor who suddenly sounded like he knew what he was talking about. Henry moved through the cabin with efficient purpose, helping an elderly man whose arthritis made the straps difficult to manage, securing a mask over a crying toddler whose mother was paralyzed with fear. "Sir, you need to return to your seat," a flight attendant called out, her voice muffled by her own oxygen mask. "In a moment," Henry replied, his tone brooking no argument. He was checking seat belts, ensuring passengers were properly secured, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had handled emergencies before. His limp was barely noticeable now, adrenaline and purpose overriding the old injury. In the cockpit, Laura was fighting a losing battle. The aircraft was bleeding altitude despite her efforts, and the emergency descent procedures that should have been second nature to Marcus were clearly beyond his current capabilities. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she wrestled with controls that seemed to have a mind of their own. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" she called into her headset. "This is Skyline 447. We have multiple system failures and are declaring an emergency, requesting immediate vector to nearest suitable airport." "Skyline 447, this is Denver approach. We copy your mayday. Vectors to Denver International, runway 16R. Descend and maintain flight level 280. But as Laura fought to comply with the instruction, something went wrong in her body as catastrophically as it had in the aircraft. The stress, the adrenaline, the crushing responsibility of hundreds of lives, it all crashed down on her at once. Her vision blurred, her chest tightened, and a crushing pain shot down her left arm. "No, no, no," she whispered, even as her body betrayed her. The heart attack hit like a sledgehammer, and she slumped forward in her seat, her hands slipping from the controls. "Laura!" Marcus screamed. But his panic was complete now. The captain was unconscious, the aircraft was diving, and every alarm in the cockpit was screaming for attention. Oh God, what do I do? What do I do? Anya Patel had been making her way forward when the cabin pressure alarms began. Now, seeing the cockpit door open and hearing Marcus's terrified cries, she pushed past paralyzed flight attendants and stepped into the cockpit. What she saw there chilled her to the bone. Laura unconscious, Marcus hyperventilating, and the aircraft in an uncontrolled descent. "Henry!" she called out, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Henry, I need you up here now!" Henry appeared in the cockpit doorway within seconds, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation. Laura unconscious, probably a cardiac event triggered by stress. Marcus in complete panic, useless for anything requiring clear thinking. The aircraft descending rapidly through 35,000 feet, multiple system failures, and 243 souls depending on someone taking control. "I can't do this," Marcus was babbling, his hands fluttering uselessly over the controls. "I'm not qualified for this. I need the captain. She has to wake up. Make her wake up!" "Henry," said Marcus quietly, his voice cutting through the younger man's panic, "I need you to move away from the controls." "What? Who are you to—" Anya cut him off. "Henry, you know something about this, don't you? When you mentioned the hydraulic systems earlier, the way you diagnosed the problem, that wasn't a lucky guess." Henry hesitated. 15 years of conditioned invisibility warring with the screaming alarms and the knowledge that everyone aboard would die if someone didn't act. In his mind, he could hear General Hayes's voice, "You failed once, Alvarez. Don't make the same mistake twice." But louder than Hayes's condemnation was the memory of Alina's last words, "When the sky calls you back, you have to answer." "I used to know my way around these birds," Henry said finally, his voice barely audible over the alarms. Dr. Samuel Brooks, a cardiologist from Chicago who had been summoned to help with Laura's condition, looked up from where he was checking her pulse. "Used to know? What does that mean, exactly?" "It means he's our only chance," Anya said fiercely. "Look at Marcus. Look around you. Do you see anyone who has even the slightest idea what to do? You're talking about letting a janitor fly this aircraft. A janitor? Are you insane? I demand to speak to a real pilot, someone qualified." "There isn't anyone else," Anya snapped. "Captain Jensen is unconscious, the first officer is having a breakdown, and we're falling out of the sky. Unless you happen to have a pilot's license hidden in your medical bag, Henry is what we've got." Henry stepped fully into the cockpit, his hands already moving towards the controls with the unconscious precision of long practice. "Everyone needs to stay calm. Dr. Brooks, can you move Captain Jensen? I need to get to the left seat." "This is madness," Dr. Brooks muttered, but he helped shift Laura's unconscious form away from the primary controls. "When this aircraft crashes and kills everyone aboard, I want it on record that I objected to this act of desperation," Henry suggested quietly as he slid into the captain's seat. His hands fell naturally onto the yoke, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt complete. The controls responded to his touch like an old friend welcoming him home. Despite the system failures, despite the alarms, despite the terror that filled the cockpit, Henry felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This was what he'd been trained for, what he'd been born to do. The rank insignias were gone, the uniform was different, but the sky was the same sky he once owned. "Get me a damage report," he said calmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of command. "What systems are still functioning?"
Henry's hands moved over the instrument panel with practiced precision, 15 years of dormant muscle memory awakening like a sleeping giant. The Boeing 737-800 was different from the military aircraft he'd flown, but the fundamentals were the same: lift, thrust, drag, weight. The eternal equations of flight that governed everything from crop dusters to space shuttles. "Primary hydraulics are gone," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Secondary system is failing. We've got manual reversion on the flight controls, which means everything's going to be heavy and sluggish. Cabin pressure is holding for now, but barely." Marcus, who had retreated to the jump seat behind the captain's position, stared at Henry in bewilderment. "How do you know all that? You're a janitor. You clean floors." Henry's eyes never left the instruments as he began the delicate process of arresting their descent. "Right now, Mr. Kent, I'm the closest thing to a pilot you've got. Do you want to argue credentials or do you want to live?" The question silenced Marcus's protests. Outside the cockpit windows, the ground was rushing up toward them with terrifying speed. Passengers in the cabin could see it too now, the earth growing larger by the second, and their muted prayers and sobs created a chorus of desperation that filtered through the thin cockpit door. "We need to declare our intentions to air traffic control," Henry continued, his hands fighting the sluggish controls as he worked to level the aircraft. "Tell them we have an incapacitated crew and are attempting an emergency landing." Anya grabbed the radio microphone. "Denver approach, this is Skyline 447. Our captain is unconscious. First officer is unable to continue. We have someone else attempting to fly the aircraft." "Skyline 447, say again, are you declaring an emergency landing?" "Affirmative, Denver. We need vectors to the nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by." As the radio chatter continued, Henry felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. In the military, he'd been responsible for million-dollar aircraft and elite crews. Now he was responsible for nearly 250 civilians who had trusted their lives to people who should have been able to protect them. But in the back of his mind, General Hayes's voice echoed like a curse. "You failed once, Alvarez. You got Jim Morrison killed because you weren't good enough, weren't fast enough, weren't smart enough. What makes you think you can save these people when you couldn't save your best friend?" Henry's hands trembled slightly on the yoke, doubt creeping in like poison. The aircraft responded to his uncertainty, dropping another 100 feet before he caught it. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Brooks muttering about madness and death, Marcus whimpering like a frightened child, and the collective fear of passengers who had no idea that their lives now depended on a man who spent 15 years running from his past. "I can't do this," Henry whispered, the words barely audible over the alarms. "I couldn't save Jim. How can I save them?" But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, another voice rose in his memory. Elena's voice, warm and certain, and full of the love that had sustained him through the darkest years of his life. "The sky never forgets a good pilot, Henry, and you were always one of the best." The aircraft bucked and shuddered as Henry fought to maintain control, but the turbulence in his mind was worse than anything the atmosphere could produce. Every alarm, every warning light, every desperate voice on the radio pulled him deeper into memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Afghanistan, 2009. Two F-15 Eagles flying low over hostile territory, loaded with supplies for troops who needed them to survive another day. Captain Jim Morrison in the wingman position, his voice crackling through the radio with the easy confidence of someone who trusted his flight engineer completely. "Looking good, Henry. ATA to the drop zone?" 12 minutes, Jim. Maintain current heading." But Henry had missed the heat signature on his threat detection screen, a single Soviet-era surface-to-air missile that should have been visible, should have been tracked, should have been countered. His job was to see everything, to keep them both safe, and he'd failed in the most basic way possible. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and the 737's nose dropped precipitously as his concentration wavered. Passengers screamed, Dr. Brooks shouted something about incompetence, and Anya grabbed his shoulder. "Henry! Henry, stay with us!" He pulled the aircraft back to level flight, sweat streaming down his face, but the past wouldn't let him go. In his mind, he could see Jim's F-15 exploding in a ball of orange fire, could hear his friend's last transmission cut short by static and death. "I should have seen it," Henry said, his voice broken. "I should have seen the missile. Jim died because I wasn't good enough."
Jim Morrison? Marcus had been listening, and something in Henry's words penetrated his panic. Captain Jim Morrison? He was my instructor at flight school. He used to tell stories about his flight engineer, said he was the best in the business, said he'd trust him with anything. Henry's head snapped around, staring at Marcus in shock. "Jim talked about me?" "All the time. Said his engineer could read aircraft like other people read books. Said he had a sixth sense about mechanical problems." Marcus's voice was wonder and growing realization. "You're Henry Alvarez. You're the Henry Alvarez. Jim used to say you could feel what an aircraft was thinking before it thought it. The revelation hit Henry like lightning. Jim had spoken of me, had trusted me, had believed in me, even after... But no, that was impossible. Jim died in 2009. The explosion, the fire, the investigations that had ended Henry's career. That's impossible, Henry whispered. Jim died in 2009, the missile strike. No, Marcus said urgently. No, Jim Morrison retired from active duty in 2015. He was killed in a car accident 2 years ago, but he lived. Henry, whatever happened over there, he lived. The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Jim was alive? Had been alive for years after Afghanistan? But that meant the mission hadn't been the disaster Henry remembered. The guilt he'd carried, the shame that had driven him from the sky, the self-recrimination that had cost him everything, it was all based on a false memory, a trauma-induced delusion that had colored his reality for 15 years. But even as hope began to flicker in his chest, Dr. Brooks was rallying passengers in the cabin behind them. His voice carried through the thin cockpit door, filled with righteous indignation and growing panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to understand what's happening here," Dr. Brooks announced, his medical authority giving weight to his words. "They have put a janitor in the cockpit of this aircraft. This man has no qualifications, no training, no business touching these controls. We are all going to die because of someone's misguided desperation." Murmurs of fear and anger rippled through the cabin. Henry could hear passengers demanding answers, demanding real pilots, demanding that someone with actual credentials take control of their fate. But Anya's voice rose above the chaos, fierce and unwavering in its defense. "That man saved us when the cabin lost pressure. That man diagnosed the system failures before anyone else even knew there was a problem. That man is the only reason we're still flying instead of falling. Dr. Brooks, for all your medical expertise, can you land this aircraft? Can any of you?" The cabin fell silent, but Henry could feel the weight of their doubt pressing against him like a physical force. 243 people who didn't know him, didn't trust him, didn't believe he was capable of saving them. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps Dr. Brooks was right. Perhaps he was just a janitor who had forgotten his place. But in his shirt pocket, the little girl's crayon drawing crinkled softly as he moved, and he remembered her words. "You have nice eyes, like a pilot." And somewhere in the depths of his memory, Elena's voice whispered again, "The sky will catch you if you trust it, Henry. But first, you have to trust yourself." Henry's hands steadied on the controls, and for the first time in 15 years, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could fly them home.
The question silenced Brooks, but Henry could feel the weight of doubt pressing against him from every direction. In the cabin, passengers were demanding explanations, demanding real pilots, demanding someone, anyone other than the man in the janitor's uniform who was all that stood between them and certain death. "Breaker pulled," Anya reported. "Fire warning light it's still on." Henry's jaw tightened. The fire was spreading, and with their limited options, they had one chance to contain it before it reached critical systems. "We need to depressurize the cargo hold manually. It'll starve the fire of oxygen, but it's going to make the descent more complicated." "More complicated?" Marcus spoke up from his corner, his voice hollow with fear. "Henry, I don't understand half of what you're doing. How can you know all this?" "Because I've been flying aircraft since before you could spell airplane," Henry said, his patience finally fraying under the multiple pressures. "Because I've handled emergencies that would have left you crying for your mother. Because sometimes the man pushing the mop knows more about the machine than the man wearing the uniform." The brutal honesty of the statement hung in the cockpit air like smoke. Marcus flinched, as if he'd been slapped, but something in Henry's words seemed to penetrate his panic. For the first time since the crisis began, Marcus looked at Henry, really looked at him, and saw something he'd missed before. "Jim Morrison used to tell a story about a mission in Afghanistan
where his flight engineer saved an entire convoy by improvising a solution to a hydraulic failure that the manual said was impossible to fix. He said the engineer's name was Henry Alvarez, and that he was the best he'd ever flown with. Henry's hands stilled on the controls for just a moment. Jim told that story? Every chance he got. He said you could make an aircraft do things that defied physics. He said if he ever got in trouble in the air, there was no one else he'd rather have beside him. The words hit Henry like a revelation. All these years he'd believed Jim's respect had died with him in that fireball over Afghanistan. But Jim had lived, had spoken of him with pride, had considered him a friend worth remembering. The knowledge flooded through Henry like warm sunlight, washing away 15 years of doubt and self-recrimination. "Anya," he said, his voice carrying new authority, "I need you to go to the cabin and tell the passengers exactly what I'm going to do. We're going to execute an emergency descent to get below the fire risk altitude, then attempt an emergency landing at Denver. It's going to be rough, but we're going to make it." Anya nodded and hurried toward the cabin door. But she paused at the threshold. "Henry, they're scared. Dr. Brooks has been telling them you're not qualified, that we're all going to die because of your incompetence." "Then you tell them," Henry said firmly, "that the man flying this aircraft has more emergency landing experience than most pilots see in a lifetime. You tell them that I have brought home aircraft that were shot full of holes, on fire, and missing half their control surfaces. You tell them that I have never lost an aircraft or a passenger, and I'm not about to start today." As Anya disappeared into the cabin, Henry felt something shift inside him. The weight of command, the responsibility for lives, the terrible burden of being the only one who could save them. Instead of crushing him, it lifted him up. This was who he was. This was what he'd been born to do. "Marcus," he said, his voice calm and controlled, "I need you to monitor the engine temperatures while I adjust our descent rate. Can you do that?" Marcus straightened in his seat, some of his confidence returning now that he had a specific task and a leader who knew what he was doing. "Yes, sir. Engine temperatures." In the cabin, Anya's voice carried over the noise and chaos as she delivered Henry's message to the passengers. Henry couldn't hear her exact words, but he could feel the change in the aircraft's atmosphere as panic began to give way to something approaching hope. And then, cutting through the din of alarms and frightened voices, came a small voice that stopped Henry's heart. "I trust you." He turned to see the little girl who had given him the airplane drawing standing in the cockpit doorway, her mother's hand in hers, her eyes wide but unafraid. She held up the crayon airplane, now somewhat crumpled from the turbulence, and smiled at him with the pure faith that only children could muster. "I told everyone you were a pilot," she said proudly. "I told them you had pilot eyes." Henry's throat constricted with emotion. This child, this innocent stranger, had seen something in him that he'd forgotten existed. She'd looked past the uniform, past the job title, past 15 years of self-imposed exile, and seen the man he truly was. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "That means more than you'll ever know." As the little girl was led back to her seat, Henry felt the last of his doubt fall away like discarded armor. He was Henry Alvarez, retired Air Force flight engineer, veteran of dozens of combat missions, and the most qualified person on this aircraft to bring them home safely. It was time to stop hiding from who he was and start being who he needed to be. "Denver approach. This is Skyline 447, he said into the radio, his voice carrying the calm authority of a pilot taking command. "We are beginning our emergency descent, requesting direct vector to runway 16R and all available emergency equipment. This is going to be a challenging landing, but we're coming home." 25,000 feet and descending, Flight 447 fought its way through the turbulent air like a wounded bird determined to reach the ground. Henry's hands never left the controls.
every movement precise and deliberate, despite the sweat that streamed down his face and the alarms that continued to scream their electronic warnings. "Fire in the cargo hold is contained," Anya reported from the jump seat behind him, where she'd been monitoring the emergency systems. "But we've lost most of our electrical power. No autopilot, no auto throttles, no instrument landing system." "We don't need instruments to find the ground," Henry replied, his eyes scanning the horizon ahead where Denver International Airport was beginning to take shape in the distance. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Through the cockpit windows, he could see the emergency vehicles already positioned along the runway, red and white lights flashing like earthbound stars. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, all waiting for an aircraft that might not make it to the runway in one piece. "Skyline 447, Denver Tower. Runway 16R is clear and ready. Wind is 160 at 15 knots. Visibility unlimited. Emergency equipment is standing by." "Copy, Denver. Skyline 447 on final approach." But even as Henry acknowledged the tower's transmission, he knew the landing would be unlike anything he had ever attempted. With the hydraulics compromised, the aircraft would respond sluggishly to his commands. With the electrical systems failing, he'd have minimal instrument guidance. And with nearly 250 souls depending on his skill, failure wasn't an option. "Elena," he whispered under his breath, invoking his late wife's memory as he'd done in every crisis since her death. "Help me bring them home." And there, in the space between heartbeats, he heard her voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. "The sky will catch you if you trust it, Henry. But first, you have to trust yourself." The words wrapped around him like a warm embrace, steadying his hands and calming his mind. He'd spent 15 years running from the sky, hiding from his calling, denying the gifts that had made him one of the finest pilots of his generation. But the sky had waited for him, patient as the dawn, ready to welcome him home when he was finally ready to return. "Beginning final approach," Henry announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the aircraft through the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your pilot speaking. We're going to experience a rough landing, but I want you to know that I've done this before. Trust in your training, trust in this aircraft, and trust that we're going to walk away from this together." The ground rushed up to meet them, the runway growing larger in the windscreen with each passing second. Henry's hands danced over the controls, adjusting engine power, trimming the aircraft for the best possible glide angle, preparing for impact. Behind him, he could hear the cabin crew calling out instructions to passengers, their voices professional and calm despite the circumstances. "Brace for impact. Heads down. Stay down." The main landing gear touched the runway with a jarring impact that rattled every rivet in the aircraft. Henry fought to keep the nose wheel off the ground as long as possible, using every foot of runway to dissipate their energy. Sparks flew from the main gear as the tires began to disintegrate under the stress, and the aircraft slewed sideways before Henry corrected with opposite rudder. "Stay with me," he muttered, wrestling with controls that felt like they were fighting against him. "Come on, stay with me." The nose wheel finally touched down, and Henry deployed what remained of their braking system. The aircraft groaned and shuddered as it fought to shed speed, metal screaming against metal, rubber burning, sparks flying like 4th of July fireworks. But slowly, gradually, inexorably, Flight 447 came to rest. For a heartbeat, the only sound in the aircraft was the whisper of wind and the ticking of cooling metal. Then, as if a dam had burst, the cabin erupted in cheers and sobs and prayers of thanksgiving. Passengers embraced strangers, crew members wept openly, and the little girl's voice rose above it all. "I told you he was a pilot!" Henry slumped back in his seat, his hands finally releasing the controls that had been his lifeline for the past hour. They'd made it. Against all odds, despite system failures and equipment malfunctions and the doubts of nearly everyone aboard, they'd made it home. Henry? Marcus's voice was soft, filled with wonder and something approaching awe. That was incredible! I've never seen anything like it! Just doing my job, Henry replied, but his voice shook with exhaustion and emotion. No, Marcus said firmly. That wasn't a janitor's job. That was a pilot's job, a master pilot's job. Through the cockpit windows, Henry could see the emergency vehicles racing toward them, their lights painting the tarmac in brilliant colors. In minutes, this aircraft would be surrounded by investigators and reporters and officials, all wanting to know how a janitor had managed to land a crippled airliner with all souls aboard. But for now, in this moment of perfect stillness, Henry allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 15 years: pride in a job well done. The tarmac around Flight 447 transformed into a controlled chaos of emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights painting the aircraft in shifting patterns of color. Paramedics swarmed the scene as passengers began evacuating down the emergency slides, many of them weeping with relief, others struggling to process what they'd just survived. Henry remained in the cockpit, helping to shut down the aircraft's systems with the methodical precision that had characterized his entire career. His hands moved over switches and controls with practiced efficiency, ensuring that the wounded bird was properly secured before he abandoned his post. "Sir?" A young paramedic appeared in the cockpit doorway, medical bag in hand. "We need to check you for injuries. That was a hell of a landing." "I'm fine," Henry said quietly, not looking up from the shutdown checklist. "Check on Captain Jensen first. She's the one who needs medical attention." "Already being taken care of, sir. She's stable and conscious, asking for the pilot who brought them home." The paramedic studied Henry's face with growing curiosity. "That would be you, I'm guessing." Henry's hands stilled on the controls. For 15 years, he'd been invisible. A man whose expertise was dismissed, whose knowledge was ignored, whose very existence seemed to go unnoticed by the world around him. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted to know who he was. "I just did what needed to be done," he said finally. "Sir, with respect, what you did was miraculous. I've been working aviation emergencies for 10 years, and I've never seen a landing like that with so many system failures." As Henry finally stood to leave the cockpit, he found his path blocked by Dr. Samuel Brooks. The cardiologist's face was pale, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. "I owe you an apology," Dr. Brooks said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. You saved all our lives, and I spent the entire time telling people you were going to kill us." Henry studied the man who had been his loudest critic, seeing not an enemy, but a frightened passenger who had reacted to terror in the only way he knew how. "Fear makes people say things they don't mean, Doctor. No apology necessary." "Yes, it is necessary." Dr. Brooks extended his hand, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I judged you by your uniform instead of your abilities. I was a fool, and I'm sorry." Henry shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of 15 years of similar judgments and dismissals. "We all make mistakes, Doctor. The important thing is that we all got home safely." As Henry made his way toward the aircraft exit, Anya appeared beside him, her flight attendant uniform rumpled, but her smile radiant with pride and affection. "The reporters are already gathering," she said, gesturing toward the growing crowd of media personnel beyond the emergency perimeter. "They're going to want to know everything: how a janitor became a pilot, how you knew what to do,
who you really are?" Henry paused at the aircraft door, looking out at the sea of flashing cameras and microphones. For 15 years, he'd hidden from attention, buried himself in obscurity, convinced that he didn't deserve recognition or respect. The prospect of stepping into that spotlight terrified him more than any emergency landing. "They'll never see you as invisible again," Anya said softly, reading his hesitation. "Your secret's out, Henry. The whole world is going to know what I figured out weeks ago, that there's a lot more to you than meets the eye." Before Henry could respond, a small voice cut through the din of emergency activity. "That's him! That's the man who saved us!"
The little girl broke away from her mother and the paramedic who was checking her for injuries, racing across the tarmac with her arms outstretched. Henry knelt just in time to catch her as she threw herself into his embrace, her small arms wrapping around his neck with fierce determination. "I knew you were a pilot," she whispered against his ear. "I knew it the first time I saw you." Henry's eyes filled with tears as he held this child who had seen his true worth when no one else could. "Thank you," he whispered back. "Thank you for believing in me." When he finally stood, the little girl still clinging to his hand, Henry found himself facing Captain Laura Jensen. The pilot was pale and moving slowly, supported by a paramedic, but her eyes were clear and bright with gratitude. "Captain Alvarez," she said formally, using his former rank with deliberate precision. "I understand I owe you my life and the lives of my passengers." "Just Henry," he corrected gently. "And you don't owe me anything, Captain. We all did our jobs." "No," Laura said firmly. "You did far more than your job. You did the impossible." She turned to face the gathering crowd of reporters and officials, her voice carrying despite her exhaustion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet the man who saved Flight 447, Captain Henry Alvarez, United States Air Force retired. The finest pilot I've ever had the privilege to fly with." The crowd erupted in questions and camera flashes, but Henry barely heard them. In his shirt pocket, the little girl's crayon airplane drawing crinkled softly as he moved, a tangible reminder of the moment when someone had looked past his uniform and seen the pilot beneath. As he walked through the crowd of reporters and well-wishers, Henry's step was lighter than it had been in 15 years. He was no longer the invisible man pushing a mop through an indifferent world. He was no longer carrying the weight of Jim Morrison's death or General Hayes's condemnation. He was Henry Alvarez, pilot, and for the first time since Afghanistan, he was ready to fly again. The sky had called him home, and he had answered, not for himself, but for the little girl who had trusted him, for the passengers who had needed him, for the memory of Elena who had never stopped believing in him. As the sun set over Denver International Airport, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Henry fingered the crayon drawing in his pocket and smiled through his tears. Sometimes the most important flights weren't the ones that took you to distant places, but the ones that brought you back to yourself. The janitor was gone, the pilot had returned, and the sky was waiting. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.